Morning, everybody. We're going to get started in just like 1 or 2 minutes. Okay, everyone, I'm going to go ahead and get started because I'm going to officially cut you guys off from waiting till 9:03 to start because those 3 minutes of silence are just too much. I don't know about anyone else, but Steve Lunsford lovingly let me know that I misspelled negotiations on the calendar invite, I think. So spelling's not my forte. It's all right. We all have our strengths and weaknesses. So sorry, but listen, you made it and you're excited to hear about negotiations. So welcome. Happy Monday morning. We have a great 2 weeks of training coming up. You guys can check your calendars or little graphics that I posted on Facebook. All this will be recorded and then posted into the Facebook group afterwards. So thanks for coming. Mark, without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thanks, Rosie. Morning, everybody. Because I had to type out negotiation probably 10 times on the slideshow that I'm about to use, there is a 100% chance that I've misspelled it on that. I may have misspelled it every time, so no shame to Rosie. Spelling is also not my forte. Pretty good with numbers, bad with letters. That is definitely how my mind works. So I'm going to dive right in here because I do have a couple things to get through, and my goal is to be done certainly no later than 10, maybe even a little bit before. I really want this to be interactive. So if you want to use the chat, that's great. But also, please feel free to unmute yourself. I'm going to go through, really what we're going to do is look at 10 pieces of advice in negotiation. So 10 things to think about specifically in real estate negotiations. And I'm really going to look for examples and kind of lean on you guys to think about how would each of these apply to what we do. Quick fun side note before I dive into this. I feel like this has become less common, but you know how in agents' email signatures, sometimes you'll see 2- and 3-letter acronyms for some continuing education that they take. I think this is a generational thing. Any realtor who's like 50 and older is probably more likely to have all these three-letter acronyms for certifications that they have taken. I've only done one of those. I only have one certification, and funny enough, it is that I am a CNE, which it's the Real Estate Negotiation Institute out of New York, runs this continuing education class that I took several years ago that makes me a certified negotiation expert, which I crack up at that. Just keep in mind, that's because I spent 8 hours in a classroom, not because I'm necessarily any good at negotiations.
I don't know. That's maybe because you mark Nottingham, all of us.
Maybe, yeah. But I do think negotiation is something that I've learned a lot about, and it's a big part of what we do. And so that's one of the things we're going to do here at the start is to talk about, like, why does negotiation matter? What are some examples of negotiation in our industry? Because honestly, I think our industry gets stuck on this idea that when we say negotiation, what we're talking about is helping a buyer or seller come to an agreement on price about a property. Obviously, that's a very important example of negotiation, but there's actually hundreds of moments of negotiation in our industry because we're in a human industry, and that's what human interactions often are. Okay, so while you're all sitting there thinking how jealous you are of the CNE designation that has been of no use for me, I'm going to share my screen and dive in. Okay, y'all can see that, right? Okay, so we're going to go through 10. And before we do that, again, this is where you need to unmute yourself if you're willing. The obvious one is out there. So we know that we have to help people negotiate on price when they're either buying or selling real estate. Give me some other examples of ways in which a real estate broker has to negotiate. So what negotiations are you part of other than price on a property?
Contract terms.
Yep. So everything else on a purchase agreement other than price. Good example. Yep. What other examples? What's the
Inspections and appraisal.
Yeah, inspections and appraisal. I was going to say, what's the negotiation that we hate more than any? It's not price. It's definitely inspections. This is something that I think a lot of our clients come into a real estate transaction thinking about inspections as an already determined process. In other words, as if there is this black and white standard on what happens during inspections. So they're not necessarily categorizing the inspection process as a negotiation between a buyer and seller, when clearly that's exactly what it is a negotiation. The appraisal process can be a negotiation with the appraiser. It can be a negotiation with the lender. It can be a negotiation with the other side of the transaction. So certainly lots of examples there. What other negotiations do we do?
Maybe inclusions, like what will be included in the final purchase price and what they'll provide.
Yeah, that's good. Furniture, maybe, stuff like that. Think outside the relationship to the other side of a transaction.
Is it like the give and take of what a client would want and the push and pull of that?
Yes. Yep. You're kind of even in negotiations with your own client in the middle of those things, helping them to see things in a different way. As a realtor, do you negotiate with someone other than the other side of the transaction? And when do you do that?
I had my my buyer sign the agency agreement as part of the first, like, oh, and here's also this document when you're signing the offer. And so I didn't really treat that as like a separate negotiation, but we'd had a conversation, like the first conversation, hey, would you like to work with me, was sort of a negotiation, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can have that with a buyer. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. You certainly have a negotiation with a seller. When you're entering into a listing contract, it's actually, if you remember this from your license class, it is an important license law requirement to keep in mind and to communicate about commissions, that they are what? Negotiable, right? So you may not be willing to negotiate on a commission, which I respect, but it doesn't change the fact that even signing a listing contract is a negotiation. There are other elements to that too. How long of a term does the listing contract have? Price reductions sometimes are a part of negotiations with the seller. So there's all these examples, what you will provide for your service or as a part of your service in comparison to what you're charging. And so all these things are negotiations. I was joking about this for an example. Last week, we had this outdoor coffee with a potential client who's working on a development in downtown, and I've been working kind of with and for this entity for almost 2 years on a particular deal. Okay, and this meeting that probably should have been 45 minutes ended up being 2 hours because this client kept pushing on the same thing, and I respect them for it, but they really were pushing to kind of force us to defend value. And if you haven't had that experience yet with a seller, you are certainly going to, and that is a negotiation. So just pointing out that being an effective negotiator is certainly about helping your client get a good deal in the middle of a transaction, but it's also about advocating for yourself, figuring out how to get the best outcomes, not at the expense of the other person, but aligned to the other person. So, in another training session previously, and maybe you guys will hear me present on this one at another point in time, but I don't look at negotiations as by definition win-lose. I think this is a mistake that our industry makes, is that the philosophy of negotiation is, if Steve Lunsford and I are negotiating something, that for me to win, he has to lose, or for him to win, I have to lose. And that really, I think it's kind of a cynical way to look at this. I think that two parties are looking to find a mutually beneficial exchange of value. Steve has something that I need, and I have something that he needs. And so we ought to be able to exercise good negotiation to get a better outcome for both of us. So kind of philosophical thing that we won't hit as much today. So yeah, we hit on these purchase agreement, inspection response, appraisal, listing contract, and I think you could find kind of even micro examples of this in just about any conversation you have as a part of a deal. Okay, so I'm going to go through 10 tips here, and I really want to try to find examples and would love feedback as we go through. They're kind of in order, not necessarily, but maybe in order of priority, and think chronologically in terms of when you're in a negotiation. And the very first one is to be informed. So the best negotiator is, generally speaking, the best informed person in that negotiation. The smarter that you are about what it is you're talking, so the more informed you are, the smarter you are, the more effective you're going to be at getting the best outcome. So in our circumstances, this could be doing your homework on the other parties involved. So this might be, I've never worked with this particular realtor. I'm going to ask around my office to see if I can get any advice on how this person typically works. What type of negotiator are they? I was just with another agent on Friday, not a plat agent, another agent here in town who I've gotten to know pretty well. And it was really interesting. He was talking about, he really categorizes realtors when he's on the other side of a deal. And I think he's a very good negotiator. He's a very good agent. He said he really kind of categorizes people into 3 different camps and knows when am I working with someone where I'm going to need to build up their ego. I'm going to need to be very cautious in arguing with them. I'm going to compliment them over and over and over. And it's a pretty effective strategy. So he knows I'm going to need to go through this process, never exerting that I'm right. Because that's going to hurt our position. So he really knows that about certain realtors that he's working with. And so I think knowing the other party, you guys, there's examples of this about the client on another side of a transaction. This is a little bit of an extreme example, but this is real. This has happened. A buyer submits an offer in a multiple offer situation and posts about it on Facebook. saying something like, fingers crossed, we just submitted an offer on this property and I'm going to die if we don't get it. That's out there. Now, as the listing agent, this is just an example of what being informed on the other parties could look like. If you as the listing agent happen to come across that, so you'd have to look up, the buyer's name, it's on the purchase agreement, that's public information because they put it out there on social media. You see that and communicate that to your seller. There's an example of how being informed on the other parties helps you. Researching the property, so regardless if you're on the listing side or buying side, knowing the property very, very well, know its history, know its ups and downs, know how it compares to its neighborhood, know the neighborhood very well. So this is kind of knowing your data. So, instead of arguing for a lower price when you're representing the buyer based upon the buyer's preference, this is something that maybe is a little bit of a pet peeve of mine, is if an agent submits a lower priced offer on a property, if they can do so using the value of the home and neighborhood information and the market, it's better negotiation practice than, for example, saying something like, well, my buyer just, this is the most they want to pay, right? Well, that really means nothing to the seller. So you haven't, I think in that case, you haven't gone through the process of informing yourself to have the information to defend your position. So kind of parallel to that would be understanding larger market conditions. So knowing days on market, what percentage, so that SP percentage of LP is, what does sale price look like in comparison to list price on a typical transaction in the conditions that you're in? So just knowing those things, they may or may not work to your favor. So it's not necessarily that you would always use the information explicitly or verbally, but you need to know it, because my last point there, know where your side of the deal stands. So if you know as much as you can about the parties involved, about the real estate involved, the general market, then you know where you have the leverage and where you don't. And that's going to help you know, like, kind of when to push or when to know, like, okay, well, in this particular circumstance, we're already getting a good deal, given what I know about all these things. So I might cause my client to think a little bit harder about whether they want to push right here, right? So that's an example of being informed. Number two, build rapport. So this is something that I really did take from this CE course that I took now several years ago, and I wish this was available. It was an in-person course. Someday I hope that this is the Real Estate Negotiation Institute. I hope they come back to Indianapolis, because it was really the best CE I've ever taken. But the instructor talked a lot about this, that in most industries where the dollar amounts of negotiation are as high as they are in our industry, negotiators would find it very strange to just immediately begin negotiating. So, I mean, obviously our industry is unique, so I'm not suggesting we blow up the whole model, but when you're negotiating, say, a $500,000 something, professional negotiators would think it very strange that the introduction to that negotiation would be an email with a formal offer attached to it, which is pretty common, right, in our industry. So sometimes it feels unrealistic. I get that. My own anecdotal experience and a lot of professional research bears this out. Outcomes are better if the human beings involved can build rapport with each other first. And so some examples of this, if you are going to end up using email, which, I mean, I'm not suggesting we don't use email. So if you're going to end up using email, try to jump on the phone first. So, the instructor, I remember him talking about this. This is the most important moment in a deal, is when you're submitting an offer. And a lot of us, I think, are intimidated about getting on the phone before we do that, or maybe we feel like we don't have time to get on the phone before we do that. But I think there's anecdote and research that backs this up. Just jumping on the phone to call the listing agent and introducing yourself, talking about, we're going to come back to this, but I'm really looking forward to the chance to work with you. So one of the tips is being positive, learning what you can learn, but identify with that individual, find common ground, whatever. I guarantee you have something in common with them. Find that. That helps to build rapport. And the subconscious here, so that the research indicates that communication methods do have an impact on the outcome of the deal. So a phone call before submitting an offer, they've really borne this out nationally as they've studied this, increases the likelihood that the deal happens. But I think the kind of subconscious to that is maintaining human connection increases the likelihood that the other side of the deal remembers your side of the deal is human and has needs. So in other words, you and your client become real people when you're talking, probably not in person, but at least over the phone. And the more human you can become, the more likely the other side of the transaction is to see it as a give and take, right? They know they're human. They know they have wants and needs. And so remembering that about the other side of the deal, well, rapport is a great way to do that. I'm just glancing through the chat here. Sorry, I'm kind of behind. Yeah. Steve, your comment there, Natalie, I want to circle back to yours too. Steve's is a good comment that really connects number one and number two. Calling the other agent is a good way to build rapport and to be informed, right? Is there something unique that I'm not aware of that would be useful in making this offer attractive? This is going to get at number 3 and number 4 in terms of tips too. Yeah, so Natalie, there's another good example. Being informed to know HOA rules and restrictions. I mean, I'll admit that it's a slippery slope because I don't think you're going to present yourself as an expert on a particular HOA, but you certainly need to be able to gather that information and put it in front of your client and help them think through if there's something in there that matters to them. Okay, I'm minimizing the chat, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Okay, I'm going to slow down here at number 3. I wanted to get to this one. Asking good questions. So this could be in phone, this could be an email or a text message. One of the, again, if I had a pet peeve, it's that I see a lot of agents, they ask very short or leading questions that can be easily answered with yes or no, or they're asking a question, but they're really making a statement with the question. So something like, isn't that a great idea? Well, that's a leading question, or something. And my second point there, stick with neutral questions that encourage detailed responses, like, what do you think about the homes across the street? So if you're talking with another agent, rather than saying something like, yes, but wouldn't you agree that the homes across the street are a major problem? Well, you didn't really ask a question, right? You were essentially making a statement there. So try to keep that open-ended, asking good questions that are clarifying, they're open-ended, they're general, leaving a lot of room for the other party to share information with you. So you're asking good questions, not to try to get them to agree with you, right away, at least. You're asking good questions to learn. So perhaps when you hear something that you don't agree with or that you don't like, the first response to that, a good negotiator will often not right away jump to, oh, I disagree, or I don't like what you just said. You know, some form or fashion, immediately responding in a negative way, even if something that they have just said is, you know, it could be ridiculous, right? You could be talking about somebody that has an unbelievably, you know, just kind of crazy expectation on an inspection, or their understanding of value is just way off from the market. Well, effective negotiation is to ask good questions there. So biting your tongue and saying something like, I really want to understand where you're coming from on this. Can you clarify for me how you landed at the $300,000 value? Like, we're in your head, you know, the property's worth 350 all day long, maybe 375, and somebody's arguing for 300, rather than immediately jumping to why it's worth 375. Ask a good question. Learning how they arrived at the 300 is going to help you dismantle, right? So they don't really care about your perspective until they know that you understand theirs. Be it a good or bad or informed or uninformed perspective, asking good questions helps you get there. I'm curious, I would love feedback from y'all here. Would you rate yourself as a good question asker? And do you think that our industry is good at this? So as I talk about asking good questions, and y'all are realtors,
I would say I have not sold a home yet, so I can't answer from that. But I have an event business, so I worked as a talent buyer for numerous years, and this was always a thing in coming with like headliner negotiations or talent negotiations. Is like there's always a sticking point for an artist, and so getting like any context or thoughts on why they feel a certain way. Like an example is I did a show with Jennifer Nettles. She was obviously one of the ones involved in like the state fair stage collapse. So she has like really big security issues and safety issues that are obviously very valid, but just getting like any more info and being like really cognizant of how sensitive that conversation can be. But you have to like get to a place by really getting to know that, you know, agent and seeing like what they're comfortable with and showing them that like you can trust them and they can trust you.
Mm. Do you think our industry is generally better at asking and listening, or answering and talking? I tend to agree with Zach. Zach says 100% talking. Yeah, I think it's a really big missed opportunity. Across the board, I think if realtors learned to be better question askers, the outcomes for their clients would be better. We're all probably good enough at talking. Yeah, Jess, good clarification. Yeah, sometimes yelling. We might even be beyond talking. I think this is an art that takes a while to develop too. Like, you never arrive at being the perfect asker of questions. But I think in hindsight, being willing to critique yourself and say, okay, where was I too quick to offer a solution, or kind of jump in and give an opinion, rather than asking good questions that help me understand where the other side is coming from. So this is a good transition to the next, which maybe this is a logical conclusion or a logical follow-up from asking good questions. But again, my experience tells me that we're actually can't take this for granted, because most of us just aren't very good at listening. So a lot of times the other side of a negotiation will tell you a lot of very valuable things if you listen. And I just think as human beings, we find this very challenging. Why? So why is listening hard?
I think because of our own egos, we're more consumed with our thoughts and feelings than the thoughts and feelings of others sometimes.
Sometimes you don't know how long it's going to go. Like when you're reading a book, you can see how many pages are left. When you're listening to someone, you don't know how many pages are left that you're going to have to listen to.
So that is definitely going to cross my mind the next time I'm in one of these situations, is how many pages are left in this? I'm actually thinking of some situations that I've had recently where I'm like, oh, there was a lot of pages left in that one. That's great. Yeah, I think this springs from what Michelle said. Guys, honestly, I think there's a human element here where we want to feel like we provided value. And I think it helps us feel like we're providing value to speak. You see that? Because it feels action oriented. It comes from our expertise, our research, our aggression, our sales, skill, whatever that is. We generally feel like we're adding more value if we talk. Where I think a good principle in this, I've seen some stuff that it would say research is that the better negotiator probably spends 30% of the time talking. So as negotiations in different settings, not just real estate, are observed, I came across this one time that some research had been done that indicated the ideal percentage was 30%. It's hard to quantify, but that the better negotiator on average talked less than half in the negotiations in comparison to the other negotiator. Because you gain more by listening. One thing that good salespeople and negotiators, and obviously sales and negotiations are overlapped, right? One thing they have in common is that they're very curious. I saw this recently that a fairly large company that developed a technology tool around helping businesses hire salespeople. One of their discoveries that was kind of a big part of their value proposition was helping companies hire salespeople. They said, okay, put them through personality tests. And the most common predictor for success for a salesperson was curiosity. That if they were by nature a curious person, they would listen more than they talked. So that is hard for a lot of us. I also think this kind of goes to the how many pages are left. We have that urge to maybe even if we are quiet, we might not be listening. We're thinking about what we're going to say next, right? So trying to resist the urge to think about what we're going to say next while your counterpart is talking. Listen carefully to what they're saying. What values are they arguing for? What's the philosophy? And even try to state it back to them. Number one, if they know they were heard and understood, they're going to come to your statement with a much more open mind. That's just how human beings work. If they know you listened, they'll be much more likely to listen to you. But number two, if you really heard what they said, you know how to angle your response, right? So the better you listen on price negotiation, you know that they might really be hung up on the fact that this house doesn't have a basement. So now we're not even arguing about price. We're really arguing about what does a basement add or subtract in terms, so you got really specific. So don't waste your time on all this other stuff because you listened well. Yeah, and so the second to last there, trying to understand where the other person is coming from, that, tell me about your needs and key concerns, asking the good question and then really listening gets you to that point of, so if I'm going to try to get what we need on my side of the transaction, I have to really know what your highest values, what are your key needs and concerns. And if I haven't really listened to those, I'm not aiming at a mutual exchange of value, that mutually beneficial exchange of value. I have to understand what the other party's key needs are in order to get what we need. I would say it's a lost art, but I don't know if our industry was ever all that good at it. So I think it's just a yet to be formed art in real estate. I'll admit this one, guys, this is a little bit cheesy, but I buy into this, and y'all know exactly what this is like. Successful negotiators are optimists. I think by and large, this is true. Think positive, envision success, walk into a conversation or a negotiation assuming that there is a mutually beneficial exchange of value. So I think inspections are one where I hear this a lot. I've said these words. You get that brutal inspection report or the brutal inspection response, and you're kind of like, sorry for the expression, but I mean, guys, this is what I hear. Like, oh shit, here we go. This deal's done. Like, that is, and it's a very natural response. And I'm not saying you need to beat yourself up for having that internal response, but the world around you can sense the negativity, the pessimism, the kind of defeatist attitude in any scenario. Inspections just might be the most common where this happens. So think positive, envision the successful outcome. So this could be you're intimidated in a listing presentation. This person's not going to hire me. Or you're submitting an offer where you're like, oh my gosh, we have no chance at this, it's too low. Or you get the brutal inspection response, or an appraisal comes in. Steve's working on one, I think he said it was $16,000 low. All of these things can very quickly get you into a headspace of, I don't think this is going to work. Whether you realize it or not, that affects how likely it is that you're going to land on the positive outcome. So I'm not a what's the guy's name? Zig Ziglar. Do you guys even know who that is? He's like a motivational speaker and author. His big thing is the universe responds to positivity in kind of this like spiritual way. That's not what I'm talking about. That you can't just speak these things into existence. What I'm saying is that your expectations are contagious. That is a human reality. With your client, with the other realtor, with your teammates, with the inspector, with the appraiser, with the contractor, whatever your expectations are, whether you state them or not, you're not that good at hiding them. Human beings just generally can't hide their expectations. They will come through, and they will affect the other party's expectations. So the just very subtle in the phone call or an email when you may not be under contract. I'm curious as to how many of you do this, that like, I look forward to working with you. You've submitted the offer. Maybe it's a like crappy offer. And you're saying, I look forward to working with you. What it says to the other party subconsciously, they think we're going to end up having a deal here. Why do they think that? We're way off right now. So you're subtly, subconsciously communicating things about maybe your willingness to work hard or your openness to hearing back from them, right? So you're increasing the likelihood that that other party keeps engaging because they hear you assuming there's a win-win. I'm going to pause here and take a look at the chat. While I'm doing that, anybody want to give me pushback on this, number one, and say like, that sounds like kind of cheesy, salesy talk, or give me some examples of where they have kind of learned about themselves being positive or negative?
I mean, Mark, one thing I would say about this is, I mean, and one thing I notice about good salespeople is they're always, I've never been a negative one. So there's got to be something there, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. You're always thinking about the successful outcome. Jess, great example, 7 counter offers. I even like in Jess's comment, she says she kept saying, this is great, we were getting closer, while she was actually dying inside. So I think there's a good like discipline there that you don't have to always feel positive. And at the same time, I'm not suggesting you have to be fake. I think sometimes it's disciplining yourself to see the positive. Like, oh my gosh, I'm going crazy. We've had 7 counter offers. This is ridiculous. That's your internal reaction. But recognizing, okay, that doesn't help me get to a deal. If I allow that to be what comes through, I'm increasing the likelihood that the negotiations fall apart. I think some of the most experienced agents in our industry are not very good at this, honestly. I think they're willing to allow negativity to get a deal to fall apart really fast. Sometimes a deal has to fall apart. Can't win them all. But I think thinking positive is a way that you can keep stuff alive. I can actually hear Jess Martin saying that, by the way. This is great. We're $500 closer than we were yesterday.
We were actually $20,000 apart. We started $40,000 apart. It was very painful, 7 counters over about 7 days. But the other agent, both of us were always willing to pick up the phone and speak in between each counter. And while his clients were seeing value, they were valuing the property in a different way than how my client was valuing the property. We were open to having those discussions and sharing them. And he kept saying like, I don't want to offend. And I was very willing to accept like, yes, what he was saying could have been offensive to the seller, but I was trying to see where his buyers were coming from, how they were getting that value, and then taking that to my seller in the most gentle way I could. And then we were going back and showing how we were getting to the value we were. And they were very open to receiving that information as well. So while 7 offers was extremely painful, we did come to an agreement. And we did meet in the middle, which I think the agent and I both completely expected from day one, but we also had to work through this slowly for both sides to get to that point.
Jess, something you said there reminded me. I thought this was really fascinating. And I tried to find this number and I couldn't find it. So forgive me for not being as specific here. This Real Estate Negotiation Institute, one of the outcomes of their research is so interesting. So the number of times when an offer on a property is submitted, the percentage likelihood that that deal closes is significantly higher than realtors believe. So let's ignore our current market conditions a little bit, where you're getting like 10 offers on a property, and just say, let's go back to a kind of normal balance between a buyer and seller. You're excited to get an offer, you get the offer, and you're like, oh, this offer is terrible. Well, realtors, when asked, so take your best guess, what percentage of the time when an offer is submitted does the deal close? Realtors don't get it right. They assume that more deals fall apart than actually do. And it's because buyer and seller will oftentimes kind of have a strong negative response, offer, inspection, appraisal, whatever it is. But usually the deal closes at a higher percentage than even the professional thinks is going to happen. So kind of seeing the end sometimes can help you stay positive, to say, boy, it's hard to envision this deal closing, but the last 5 times I had one that was hard to envision the deal closing, interestingly enough, 4 of the 5 closed. Like I didn't imagine these parties would ever come to terms, and then magically they do. It really happens a lot. Good stuff, Jess. Thank you. Okay, number 6. This is a alliteration that I don't know if any of you have heard this, the BATNA. Always know your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. General Negotiation 101. Sometimes you hear people call this principle the always be willing to walk away. And as an agent, I think this is something where you can really help your client know their best alternative, right? One example, a question that I have found to be very helpful with clients. So when they're, we've talked about this, buyers right now are struggling a lot to determine, gosh, should I really offer $25,000 over list price? Very common conversation. Many of us are having that right now. It's a negotiation question, right? I ask people to think through, okay, there's 2 outcomes here. And I want you to think through waking up tomorrow morning in both of these scenarios. Which one are you willing to live with? So just a very specific example. Let's say you offer $25,000 over list price, which you're thinking about doing, and you get the house. Now you're thinking, oh, could I have paid less? Right? It's just a natural question. Are you willing to live with that feeling of, maybe I could have paid less? Mirror image scenario, you offer significantly less money. You wake up the next morning and somebody else bought the house. And as it turns out, you later find out you could have bought the house if you'd offered $25,000 over list price. You wake up the next morning. Are you kicking yourself that you didn't offer $25,000 over list? Or are you willing to live with saying, no, I think I made the right call, right? Like, okay, now that I know what I know, maybe I would have acted differently, but under the circumstances, I think I made the right call, and I'm willing to live with having lost the house because I think I made the wise offer. It just didn't work out. So I think helping them to get a couple steps ahead, lay out the outcomes. There's a couple ways this can go. Let's talk through those. Any scenario, any strategy has risk. There's no such thing as a zero risk strategy. They all risk something. So knowing the best alternative, so that might be, in this case, like, well, there was another house you really liked, right? Or that's okay. I don't really need to move. I just, a teammate of mine sent me an email last night about a situation where a seller is about to list their house, but they're not busting at the seams. They didn't get relocated. They like their current house. So being really aware that their best alternative to a negotiated agreement is staying put in a house that they can continue to live in that they really like. You see how that gives them leverage. Keeping that front and center is how they know where they have power in the deal. What are some other examples here of BATNAs in our industry? So the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, or ways in which you can help clients think through alternatives rather than just simply, what's the best that I can do with the other party? Thinking through, what are my alternatives? There are negative examples of this, by the way.
I have one with, so the house where I just had 7 counter offers. At any point, my seller could have rejected one of those counter offers. And we talked about that as an alternative. That was not her best alternative. But I said, you are in control. You can choose to counter or you can reject this. If you reject it, know that if we're sitting on the market through the weekend, we're probably going to do a price reduction in this amount. And so that gave her what the alternative was. I wasn't giving her an ultimatum. She was really in control of that situation. But those were kind of the options we were looking at.
Mm. Yeah, staying on the market with a price reduction. Very good example of being aware of your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Probably helps you make the right decision and know how much leverage you have or don't have. Thanks, Jess. Okay, number 7, be aware of the anchoring bias. I'm curious for thoughts on this one because I think this is good negotiation principle, but we are in very interesting market conditions right now. But so that research on negotiation shows that the first number mentioned, whether it's realistic or not realistic, arbitrary, founded, it does exert powerful influence on the negotiation that follows. So another way of saying this is that human beings are not able to forget the starting point of a negotiation. We just don't. So the more you're aware of that bias, the more I think you can try to reframe the conversation. So in some situations, you try to avoid this by being the first person to make an offer. So like you're the first person to throw out a number. But in most scenarios in our industry, that doesn't apply. But why is that? Why doesn't this apply to negotiations in most residential real estate transactions? Maybe said another way, what is the first offer between a buyer and seller in our industry.
There's a degree to which it's the list price. So the seller is naming the first number.
Yeah.
Then it's also the buyer is the one who comes with the second number.
Yep. Yeah. And Allie just commented, it's exactly right. The list price is the first number. Now, our industry is unique in that when the first offer is made, you very rarely know who the two parties are going to be. The seller doesn't know who the buyer is going to be. Where I think there are some scenarios in real estate negotiations where this does come into play. Here's an example of rental property that I own. I got a phone call from somebody that wants to buy it. And I jumped at the chance to throw out a number. Because now they've initiated communication, but they didn't make an offer. And so I wasn't thinking like the words anchoring bias. I was like, okay, yeah, I want to start the conversation on a number that when they look at it, maybe they're going to say, oh, that's crazy. And that my goal was I'm trying to anchor the conversation to a number that is favorable. But I don't think it's necessarily that you need to be the first person to make the offer. But let me give you an example of this kind of in two different ways. And this kind of works in our current market conditions. Recognizing that the list price of a property is just a number. So acknowledging that there is this subconscious bias to looking at list price as influential or definitive and what that property is eventually going to trade hands for. So we have that bias, but recognizing the bias helps us to see list price as just a number. And this can go in both directions. So under normal market conditions, might have a property that's listed for $500,000 when you're like, this property is only worth $450,000. I know it. So let go of the anchoring bias to say, well, if you're right, if the property is only worth $450,000, it's likely going to trade hands somewhere close to $450,000 eventually. So walk into it recognizing the 500 creates a bias, but that you can work through that. So avoid being anchored to the 500. Talk about value. Don't talk about discount from list price, right? If you're talking about your offer in comparison to 500, you're anchoring. So don't apologize for submitting an offer $50,000 below list price. Move right to market value as the anchor, right? Not list price. The reverse of this is true right now. Property is listed for $225,000 and you know that your buyer's going to have to pay $250,000 or more to get it. Don't be anchored to the $225,000. It's just a number, right? Help them let go of $225,000, because here's the reality of this principle is that your buyer is anchored to the $225,000. You see what that means? If the property had listed for $260,000, your buyer, it's very clearly proven out. Property listed for $260,000, your buyer would be much more comfortable offering $250,000 than the property being listed for $225,000. They just feel like they're overpaying. They cannot let go of that anchor. So I think sometimes your job isn't to talk them into paying $250,000. It's to say, don't be anchored by the $225,000 or the $260,000. What's the property worth to you? That's the conversation. Other examples of that, the anchoring bias. Inspections have anchoring bias. What's an example in an inspection of an anchoring bias? When you're on the buying side, do you normally send you get that 40-page inspection report, and you know your buyer's only going to ask for 3 things. Do you send the whole report? You should. I think a couple of you are nodding. It's a way to anchor. So you're aware of the anchoring bias that you can, sometimes you'll even send the 40-page report 24 hours before you send your response. Anchor, you're aware of the anchoring bias. You anchor the seller. You haven't even really made the big ask. You can still anchor the seller to the, oh my gosh, the significant material defect issue section of this report was 4 pages long. Now all of a sudden, 24 hours later, your buyer's response looks really reasonable. It's totally human science to that. You can anchor the other side in a way that benefits you. Always ask for something in return. So we often in our industry, we get stuck on making concessions and demands on a single issue, usually price. But our negotiations are never over a single term. Never. At no point in the transaction are you ever actually negotiating one term, because there's always multiple variables, and you can capitalize on the presence of those issues to get both sides more of what they want. So this goes back to asking good questions and listening. So you can identify things that the other side of a deal cares a lot about. Steve referenced this, making a phone call to the listing agent to learn, oh, wow, the sellers care a lot about timing, or they care a lot about the type of financing or the down payment. Or they really don't want to deal with inspection problems, right? And so you can gain something in another term of the negotiation by acknowledging there's always multiple things at play. So when you ask for something in return, they feel like the other party actually feels better about what they just got if they have to give something. This is a little bit counterintuitive, but let me give you an example here. You're 2 weeks into a 4-week pending period. And all of a sudden the buyer says, hey, would it be possible for us to delay closing by 5 days? Could we extend our contract by 5 days? Like, we weren't expecting this, but we had something come up. We're gonna have to some out of town travel, and we'd like to extend 5 days. Now, your seller, perhaps they could care less. Deal's been good. I don't really care about the 5 days. It's a very little cost to me as the seller to extend 5 days. However, we're in the middle of negotiating the last item of the inspection response. It could be $75. Are you going to repair the sink or replace the faucet? I mean, some small thing. And they may not be directly connected, but a really good negotiator will find a way, either explicitly or implicitly, to tie those two things together. And so I even encourage agents to hold on to things, hold on to requests or offers until you need them. Wait. It's like sit tight on something so that okay, I've got this for when I need it. Like in that moment of I'm going to need to ask for something, boom, now I have something to offer. Or the reverse, right? When you're going to, or when you have a situation where the other side has asked for something, knowing that I have something I need to ask for. So tying those two things together, the number of times I have seen the inspection agreement tie to other issues. Y'all seen this. So just acknowledging the reality that inspection responses aren't negotiated in a vacuum. They're negotiated in the middle of all of these other terms in a deal. And I think it's our job as agents to recognize there's always something else. There's always some other lever that you could try to pull that may not matter all that much to the other party. You don't know unless you ask. I'm gonna, skip through here and try to get through 9 and 10. Presenting multiple options at the same time. So again, I see this a lot in inspections as being a very effective strategy. So a lot of you do this, but in inspection responses, you might submit a response that says, hey, that we're going to ask the seller to have licensed and insured contractors address the following. Or you could have the buyer's contractor that we already had bid repair it, and here's the cost. Or give a credit of some dollar amount at closing. So sometimes inspection responses presenting multiple options at the same time can be effective. You're not cornering the other person. You're allowing them to decide what's of highest value for us. Perhaps it's money, but perhaps it's convenience or simplicity. Interesting example that a friend of mine had on their house last week. They actually had someone offer a particular purchase price with an appraisal. The buyer made an alternative offer, said 2 active offers from the same buyer. So we'll pay you $195, or we'll pay you $190 and we'll waive appraisal. So it's actually allowing the seller to determine how attractive is a guaranteed $190,000 where the buyer will make up any difference. The appraisal now is no longer of any contingency. So you're kind of allowing the seller to like make a bet on what it's going to appraise for. So allowing them to make the value judgment. I thought it was a fascinating approach from the buyer and the buyer's agent to present these 2 alternatives at the same time, letting the seller decide. And interestingly enough, the seller actually took the lower dollar amount, very likely saving the buyer $5,000. Well, you'll never know, right? Well, I suppose you would know because you know what it appraises for, but it's under contract at $190, so we'll never know what it would have appraised for. But I think that's a pretty interesting strategy. It doesn't apply to every point in the transaction, but certainly during inspections. Last one, repeat, is listen. I think this is perhaps the one that runs through all 10 of these. Becoming a really good listener. So not just asking good questions, but intently listening to what the other side values. Like really hearing what they're saying. I think these are the best negotiators. They're people that talk 30% of the time, ask really good questions, intently listen, restate what the other party said, become very good at recommunicating. And so I think this is an area where all of us have room to grow and works against common perception. I think common perception is that a good negotiator is a smooth talker. But I think a really good negotiator is a great listener because they're the best informed.
Mark, I have 2 questions for you. That's okay.
Fire away.
Number 1, correct me if I'm wrong here. Is there a way for agents to search if an agent outside of our brokerage has had a cross deal with a plat agent? Is there a way to search for that in MyBor?
Yeah. Yep. You could search using our office code. So like buy sell agent was this agent ID, and then sort those with the office code of the other agent to just really quickly see if there was any plat collective.
That's great. And then my other question is, you mentioned that story right at the beginning where you were having to defend your own value to a potential client. that would make me really nervous, to have to explain like why I'm valuable. Can you share a little bit more about what you actually said to that client about your own value?
That he was crazy for not being able to see it. No. I think this actually comes to the knowing your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. That is a lot of times, like, confidence doesn't just come from, I know I'm the best person for the job. Sometimes your confidence can come from, I'm going to be okay if the other party says no. And so I was at a point in the negotiation where I knew I had made my best offer. I also knew it was a good offer. I'd done the research, I've run the numbers. I know that they ought to say yes to it based on what they value. But I'm going to be okay if they say no. So I know I'm not going to move. Then I think that helps you speak confidently, where they get the impression like, oh, the other side of this negotiation is going to be okay if I walk away. That makes it more likely that they say yes, but I keep coming back to restate things that they have said. That's how you defend your value. I have heard you, in this case, I have heard you over the last 18 months talk about this as being a really important part of this decision for you. And here's why we can help you achieve that. That's how you defend your value. It's still about them. You've said this is important to you. Let's talk about that. So you're not necessarily saying, I'm the greatest. You're appealing to what it is that you defend your value by starting with something that they have said they value. Easier said than done. I'm reading through this comment. Yeah, it's really great. Yeah, I love that. I didn't feel upbeat at all. I was kind of crushed. But I think sometimes you really have to engineer positivity in how you respond. Y'all, thanks for joining, for participating. I think this is a topic that you never arrive. There's always growth in this. Getting feedback from other people in the middle. So asking other plat agents about the other realtor, getting their take on market value, like utilize your brokerage in helping you be informed, knowing your best alternative to negotiated agreement. Like, well, okay, I want to ask good questions, but what in the world should I ask here? Utilize your brokerage to help you through this. And someday I hope I'll be able to connect you to the Real Estate Negotiation Institute. I really would like them to come back to Indianapolis someday. Hopefully they do. Okay. Training adjourned unless Rosie has something else.
I was going to say, join us tomorrow morning. Jess is going to be talking on sellers and listing presentations. So see you then.